What's up, community? My fellow car audio enthusiasts. Today we're going to discuss some of the ins and outs of using heat shrink to protect your cabling in your car audio system. So in most cases, what you see is people using the heat shrink in this manner to solve several problems. One, to address holding insulating or protective covering over your wire. Also to prevent to maximize the amount of insulation so you have the least amount of exposed conductor so that you're not likely to have that connect with something like a ground and cause a short. And in most cases, this type of heat shrink works just fine for all of these environments. But there is an exception to that rule. That's a really nice looking cable, isn't it? So the exception to the rules, I'll talk about a few of them. One of them is if you're going to be running this stuff. This is copper clad aluminum. So we got our aluminum here, copper clad, and we insert it in our copper lug. And then we would crimp this lug and make a connection here. And then to finish that off, we would take a piece of our logo heat shrink and put it on and create something that looks like this. Well, shrunk up. And this would normally be a reasonably good connection. The problem comes in with this particular wire being copper clad aluminum is you've got two different types of metals and you've got electricity running through. All you need to do is add water, dirty water or just normal tap water. And now you have electrolysis happening in here. And so as electrolysis happens inside there, it takes material away from either the copper or the aluminum. Usually it's the aluminum. And that will cause the material that's inside here to get smaller and eaten up. And over time, that connection will become weaker and weaker because the material that's in between those two metals will get eaten away, whether it be the copper or the aluminum. And that's where aluminum wire fails. So you say, well, I put a heat shrink on it, so it's good and tight. Shouldn't be any water getting in there. Well, maybe you're right. Think of this heat shrink on this wire as a rubber band strapped around a balloon. Okay, you got rubber on rubber contact, good and tight. It should be watertight. But is it? So that's where the question comes in. Now, if you're doing a build where you've got stuff, all these connections are happening in an environment where there's no water, then you don't have to worry about this. But if it's not, then you have an issue. And I've got a piece of cable here with a heat shrink on it. And under the edge of this heat shrink, I can get my fingernail under there and pick that up. That's not watertight. There's a possibility water could get in this connection. So considering that we're using copper clad aluminum, that would be a problem. And now you've got water, you got the three things you need: two different metals, electricity, and dirty water.
And for those of y'all who haven't seen it, that's what CCA looks like when it starts to corrode. Turns into a powder and breaks down just like this. And it causes things like this to happen. This was a fuse block.
You got corrosion. And once the corrosion starts, it's only going to get worse and worse. And what's worse than that is the fact that it's going to be hidden behind a heat shrink. So you won't even be able to see it. And you'll walk up there and look at the wire will look totally normal. Meanwhile, it's got essentially wire cancer going on inside of it. It's eating itself away from the inside. Over time, it gets brittle. You'll notice one day that it just feels weak in the joint. Like, why does that feel so floppy? This is if you catch it, of course. And the reason is because there's only about half the wire there that there was before. It's all full of white powder and green powder, and it's very bad electroplating happening in there, and it's just falling apart. And then you have a lot of heat build up, and the heat makes everything worse. And before you know it, you have a wire that's broken loose out of its connector and is now flopping around, going somewhere, doing something. Let's hope you have a fuse in that system, because if that wire comes into good solid contact with metal, you now have a big old chunk of heating element that's going to be getting hundreds of amps of current, and it's going to be just ready and waiting and willing to set your vehicle on fire. All of this comes from using copper clad aluminum to begin with. But if we're going to be using copper clad aluminum, there is a solution for that problem. Now, most of this type of these little name brand heat shrinks are just the same material on the inside and the outside. It's a rough, kind of a dull, just a rubber, right? However, there are some, like this one here, for example, which is a totally different game. And it comes, you can get it in rolls, okay? It's just a short piece. And I'm going to cut a piece off here so I can show you guys. So I'm going to cut a little sliver off where I can easily flip it wrong side out. And I'm going to show you the difference between these two. Okay. I'm going to try to turn this thicker piece wrong side out. It is very rigid. Yeah, there we go. Oh, yeah, I got it. All right. So I got that one turned wrong side out. Now this is the other one. I cut a little sliver off of it where I could flip it wrong side out. And I'm going to show you the insides of these two pieces of heat shrink. All right. So this one over here under my thumb, that is marine grade heat shrink. You see that? It's the inside. You see that shiny? That's glue. You'll see on this one, there's maybe a little tiny bit of shiny. For the most part, it looks like it does on the outside. This guy here, that's a thick layer of shiny. So here's what it looks like on the outside. See if I can get that to focus. And that's the inside. See that? That's huge. Now, going back to this little piece I have. All right, come on, give me a focus. This is what it looks like on the outside, and this is what it looks like on the inside. And again, it's not wanting to focus. There we go. Not much difference, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's your local car audio shop or what. Your local car audio shop's brand, install gear, GP car audio, Sky High, Scar. You pick one. It doesn't matter. They all source these heat shrink wraps, this material they make them out of from the same places, and it's a real basic heat shrink. It's good for conduction prevention and for dress up and retention. It's not good for waterproofing. If you're wanting to waterproof something, you're going to need to use this thicker, heavier gauge, high quality stuff with the glue inside of it. Now, I use the worst case scenario with an aluminum CCA wire. And, the CCA wire, which is the worst case scenario, and a copper lug. But, of course, if you're using a copper wire, like some of this America series from GP Car Audio, or the Diamond Edition, or any of that stuff, or some of the good copper wire from New Concepts, it's and then a copper lug, then less of that problem exists, because now you don't really have the two different metals. You still have the water, you still have the electricity, but you're using similar metals. So you guys know about ferrules, right? Wire ferrules. Everybody raise your hand. I'm looking. Yeah. So anyway, this is a wire ferrule. Now what we do with those, again, I'm using CCA wire here because it's the worst case scenario. What we use these wire ferrules for is to take all this little bushy wire, and I really screwed this up. Yeah, it's a horrible job, but the point will be made anyway. So you take all that squishy wire, and then you put a ferrule over it, and you see I got a little wire sticking out here. And then whenever you use this to insert it into your amplifier or blocks or whatever, you're creating a easier to work with thing that's stronger, cleaner, neater, less likely to cause problems. It's easier to pull out and put back in again. All those things are relevant. Ferrules are awesome, but ferrules also do introduce second type of material. Even if it's a copper ferrule, it's going to be usually a copper ferrule like this, which is plated copper. So there's an extra piece of metal in there. Again, if you're out in the wilderness outside of your vehicle, adding that extra piece of metal, that's just a failure point. However, in this scenario, it's something that you're going to be pulling out and putting in every now and then. You'll see that it's starting to break down. It's also not necessarily covered up. So whenever you're putting in one of these, you strip the wire back, you put the ferrule on, and then you need to take a piece of heat shrink. Now, this is the part that's really cool. So bear with me, guys. Don't miss this one. You take your piece of heat shrink and you put it on, and you leave, between an eighth and a quarter inch of it overlapping the little flange at the base of the heat shrink. And then we're going to take this heat gun here and shrink it up. Now, normally, when you put this in a terminal on the amplifier and crank down the set screw, that set screw is going to crush that ferrule around the wire and create a good mechanical connection that'll keep the wire from pulling out of the ferrule or pulling out of the terminal. It's really solid. In this case, we're not going to give it that luxury. The only connection this ferrule is going to have to this wire is this piece of heat shrink. And I will reiterate, this is not your average heat shrink. This is marine grade heat shrink. And I'm going to show you something up close. So, if I can get her to focus on it, y'all see that glue right there? A little line? That's glue right there. I'm wiping it with my finger. It will cool off and become a solid. That glue is seeping down into that wire on both ends, as well as right up here. It's seeping on there and making a physically, it's grabbing the wire and the ferrule. And even though this ferrule has not been crimped, and there's nothing to stop this ferrule from coming off of here except this piece of heat shrink, it's still going to fight you. And I want to show you guys just how much of a fight I can muster with this. So I'm letting it cool off a little bit. It's still pretty warm right in here. All right, so let's get some pliers. It's still pretty warm, but we'll go ahead and pull it. We'll get ourselves some pliers, and we'll put it on the barrel here. Yeah, that's not moving. I'm gonna grab it the other way. Let's try twisting it. Let's get a hold of it. Good. We're gonna twist it and mangle it. Oh, I'm starting to pull it out now. Well, that's what it took for me to get that out of there. And it was still hot. It wasn't even cooled off all the way. But the point is, a good piece of marine rated heat shrink can keep the water out of your connection. And if you're running aluminum into copper, you want to keep that connection dry. But even if you're running copper into copper, you want to keep it dry. So how do you make use of this? You want your branded stuff, okay? Like GP here. You want your branded logo on there. So when you're making those connections, make your connection, and then just use regular marine grade heat, and then slide one of your dudes on top of it. Make your connection. So now you've got a physical connection and a aesthetic connection. Easy to solve. You don't have to use the marine grade stuff inside your vehicle. I still would. I mean, why not just use all marine grade heat shrink everywhere, and then you don't have any problems. Be aware that not all heat shrinks are created the same. That's the takeaway from this. And this stuff is cheap. It's not expensive to order. For you to order a few feet of it is, $10. But for a company that's making thousands and thousands and thousands of these, they're going to order the material that's half the price and still get the same perceived effect. They're all going to do this. Install gear, whatever. They're all using those. So go on the internet, find you a roll of 1 inch. This is 1 inch. It'll do an alt gauge. Find you a roll of 1 inch or 1.25 inch heat shrink with glue, marine grade heat shrink with glue. Order that stuff. Order you a roll of red and a roll of black, and problems are solved. Just know that they're not all the same. Peace, guys.